Okay, hey everybody, chapter 17, part A. So in this chapter we're going to talk about evolution some more, and this time we're talking about mechanisms of evolution. So hopefully you started to get the feel for what evolution is in the last chapter. And in this chapter we're going to talk about what causes evolution. What are the mechanisms that cause evolutionary change? And so as we get started, just two definitions. So the first one is population. So a population is a group of a particular species that's in the same area at the same time. All right, and so evolution happens at the population level, not individual. So when you think about evolution happening, sometimes we tend to mistakenly think that, maybe as dinosaurs evolved into birds, there was one individual dinosaur that got feathers, and that was the ancestor of all birds. But it's not how it happens. Evolution changes populations. It's also important to remember that populations have variation. So earlier in the semester, we talked about bell-shaped curves. And so populations naturally have variations within them. And this is because of sexual reproduction. So meiosis creates genetic diversity. And so since populations are usually reproducing sexually, then the population is going to have variation in it. Earlier when we talked about bell curves, we talked about how a population naturally has variation for height in it. If you remember the slide that had the students in the class all lined up on the bleachers from the shortest to the tallest, you could see that there was variation. So there were some short people and there were some tall people and there were a lot of people that were of average height. So we can say that this is true for height, but it's also true for other characteristics and traits that you can easily identify, like hair color and eye color, etc. And again, these variations are caused by different alleles in a population. So if you are short, or if you are tall, or if you are of average height, then that is driven largely by the alleles that you inherited from your parents. So when we look at populations, we can also think about all the genes that are in a particular population. So all the genes in a population is called the gene pool. And in this goofy picture from the book, you can see these, what are those? Hogs? Wildebeests? I don't know what those things are, but they all have alleles. So some of them are homozygous for the dominant, and some of them are heterozygous, and some are homozygous recessive. And when they reproduce, they're just passing on the alleles that they have. So the gene pool is just a collection of all the genes and therefore all the alleles that are present in a population. So if a population has a lot of diversity, then the gene pool has a lot of diversity. And if a population is just a few individuals perhaps and they're really inbred, then that gene pool is going to be smaller and have less variation. So new alleles can appear and disappear. And that should say gene pool, not gene Paul, my bad. How do new alleles appear in a population? Well, that's through mutation. We'll see that in just a second. And how do alleles disappear? Well, one way that alleles disappear is natural selection selects against them and removes them. So the point is, populations have a gene pool which represents all of the genetic variation available, represented by all the alleles that are possible or that are present, and you're going to see that evolutionary mechanisms shape the gene pool. All right, so that means that the gene pool can change over time due to evolution. And sometimes we pay attention to allele frequencies, and that just means how frequent or how common an allele is in the gene pool. So if you go back to that slide of tall and short, medium height people, then the alleles that cause someone to be really tall or really short are rare, and the alleles that cause someone to have average height or medium height would be more frequent. So we can define evolution as simply a change in allele frequencies in a population over time. So in other words, for evolution to happen, all that needs to be going on is the allele frequencies need to be changing over time. So one more time, we'll go back to that slide of the short, medium, and tall people. And for that population of students, for them to evolve and and have different heights, then over time, the tall allele would need to get more frequent or less frequent, or the short allele would need to get more frequent or less frequent. The point is that the population balance of alleles needs to change over time. Okay, and so how is that allele frequency going to change? In other words, how is evolution going to happen? Well, one way is through natural selection along with other mechanisms. So we'll come back to that in a minute. So let me give you an example. So imagine this is a population, and this could be whatever you want, whatever is easiest to imagine. So let's say these are, I don't know, birds. And so in the beginning, each square is representing a bird, and we're just paying attention to the allele that causes feather color. So in this case, the population doesn't have any diversity. The whole population is just blue birds. All right, now imagine that, I don't know, somebody built a skyscraper, or that's silly. There's a mountain that appears, whatever. Something happens that ends up splitting this one population into two. All right, so now we've got the population of bluebirds on the left and the population of bluebirds on the right. So this isn't evolution yet, but it's creating a situation where it's going to be easier to see evolution occurring. All right, and over time, let's say that these populations, they reproduce and some mutations pop up. So in the population on the left, we get a mutation that causes red feathers and yellow feathers. And in the population on the right, we have a mutation that also causes red feathers and one that causes green feathers. So now we've got new alleles represented. So already these mutations have caused evolution to occur in the sense that they're changing allele frequencies. The blue allele frequency has declined. There's fewer blue alleles because now there's more red and yellow or red and green alleles. Okay, now let's say natural selection does its thing. So in the population on the left, for whatever reason, let's say the red birds are getting killed, they're getting eaten. So maybe there's a predator that can see red, and so it's eating red birds. So the black X's represent natural selection taking out or removing those red birds from the population, and therefore removing the red allele from the population. On the right, let's say there's a different predator, and this one eats bluebirds, and so in this population, the bluebirds are going to become less frequent, and the blue alleles will be removed from the population, while the red and the green alleles will persist. So what's going to happen over time? Over time, in the population on the left, you're going to have blue and maybe a few yellow birds, and the one on the right, you're going to have red and green birds. And so as these birds reproduce, then those alleles are going to maintain that frequency, and on the left, we're going to get, again, blue and yellow, and on the right, we're going to get red and green. Oops. So what's happened here is we've got evolution in progress. In the beginning, we had one population of just blue birds, and in the end, we had two populations. One population with blue and yellow birds, and one population with red and green birds. And so this is evolution at its most basic. Okay, so let's talk about an overview. So what I just showed you was that first off, mutations cause variation in a population. So mutations can create new alleles. So they created red and green and yellow alleles. Right? So mutations are a source of new information. Second, evolutionary mechanisms act on those allele frequencies. So we saw natural selection selecting against particular colors of birds. Third, the populations are reproductively isolated. So that mountain that grew kept the population split, and that kept the alleles from going back and forth. This is important because if there isn't isolation, if I go back, right, well, I'll go here. If that mountain was to be removed, then the yellow birds could go to the right and the red birds could go to the left, and this population would get all mixed up. So the presence of the mountain keeps these two populations isolated, and it prevents these alleles from going back and forth between the populations. And when you don't have alleles going between the populations, then these two populations over time are going to get less and less similar. As you can see here, one is mostly red and one is mostly blue. All right, and so when these things play out, we end up with a new species. So here we could say that maybe maybe the bluebirds are the same species they've always been, but we've got a new species over here on the right, and we've got some red birds that have showed up for the first time. So the combination of mutations, evolutionary mechanisms, and isolation lead to speciation, or the creation of a new species. Now let's talk about each in turn. First up is mutations. So again, we've talked about this a couple of times. So mutation is just new genes, new genetic information. All right, and so mutation is just a change in DNA that's inheritable. In other words, it can get passed on to the offspring. We don't really care about mutations unless they can get passed on to the offspring. Mutations are simply a change in the DNA, and if you remember, if you change the DNA, then you're going to change the RNA sequence. And if you change the RNA sequence, then you're going to change the amino acids, and if you change the amino acids, you're going to change the protein. So DNA has mutations have the effect of changing proteins that are produced. And that might not sound like a big deal, but proteins get stuff done in a cell. So if you go about changing the proteins, then that will lead to things like yellow birds or red birds or whatever. All right? And then with mutations, if a mutation is helpful, then it'll be selected for, and if it's not helpful, it'll be selected against. So we can say that there's three types of mutations. The first one is lethal mutations. Sometimes a change in the DNA leads to a protein that doesn't work the right way, and so that's going to kill the organism. And so those lethal mutations are going to get selected against by natural selection. So natural selection is going to remove any mutation that is bad. Some mutations don't really do anything, so they might not have an effect on the organism at all. We call these neutral mutations. And so if it's neutral, then natural selection isn't going to act on that either, because it's not helping, and it's also not hurting the organism, so natural selection doesn't really select against it or select for it necessarily. And the third category is beneficial mutations. Beneficial mutations create a protein that, for whatever reason, change the organism in a way that allows it to better survive and get resources and reproduce. So beneficial mutations are selected for by natural selection. Natural selection makes a beneficial mutation more common because the organisms that have the beneficial mutation can have access to resources that they wouldn't necessarily have without it, or they can survive better or have more kids. So for example, lactose tolerance in human populations are an example of a beneficial mutation. The mutation that lets us digest lactose in milk helps us drink milk, digest it, get nutrients from it, and so over time in the human population, at least in populations that had access to milk, lactose tolerance was selected for. All right, let's do another example, this time with cookies. So if we think of DNA like a recipe, right, and it is similar to a recipe. DNA codes for how proteins are made, and a cookie recipe codes for how to make a cookie. And so let's look at a chocolate chip cookie. So this is our original recipe. This would be our original DNA code. And here it is. So instead of alleles, it's different ingredients. And we've got a stick of butter, a cup of sugar, and so on. And so if you put all these things together and then you bake it in a particular way, you end up with a delicious chocolate chip cookie. Let's say there's a mutation. So for whatever reason, one of the aspects of the recipe changes. So in this case, instead of adding 2 eggs, we add 2 avocados, right? So that's a mutation. So what is natural selection going to do to our mutated recipe? Well, if natural selection, let's say in this case, natural selection is going to promote a delicious cookie, but we're not going to keep making cookies using a mutated recipe where the end result is a gross cookie. And with 2 avocados and instead of 2 eggs, we could say that this is probably a pretty gross cookie. It's going to be green and maybe slimy. So we would say that those cookies don't get eaten or they don't get recreated. So in this case, the selection of the people making the cookies is going to go against this mutation. But what if there's a mutation where instead of adding 12 ounces of chocolate chips, we add peanut butter, right? And so this is a mutated recipe, and this mutation is going to be tasty as long as you don't have a peanut butter allergy. And so people might eat this cookie and make more of it. And so here we have an example where a mutation in the recipe leads to a second type of cookie. So now we have two types of cookies. So this is kind of like a mutation leading to natural selection, selecting for that mutation and leading to two species of organisms, right? So this is an example of how natural selection gets rid of bad mutations and promotes good ones, and how mutations can lead to new species forming. All right, let's talk about natural selection. So natural selection is going to select for particular alleles and against other alleles. And so this can play out in a lot of different ways, but here's three classic ways that this can play out. So to begin, think about a bell-shaped curve showing the natural variation in a butterfly population. So if you look at the image and you look at up here, if you look at the setup, in each case the population has a bell-shaped curve, and you can see that the blue butterfly phenotype is most frequent, and the white ones are rare and the black ones are rare, right? And so that's the setup for all three of these different examples of natural selection. So in the first type of natural selection, this is called directional selection. So in directional selection, natural selection shifts the population in a way that it moves the bell-shaped curve to the right or to the left. So these arrows represent natural selection. So in this example, we begin with this type of population, and then let's say a predator comes in and this predator eats blue butterflies and white butterflies. So as it eats the blue and the white butterflies, then those alleles get removed. And so what's going to happen is over time, you're going to end up with more purple alleles. So over time, natural selection is going to cause a directional shift. It's going to move this bell-shaped curve from here, where it has blue and white butterflies in it, and it's going to shift it to the right, so that eventually our population is going to have more purple butterflies. So a real-life example of this is with the pepper moths in England. So pepper moths, their population normally is either white or black, and they like to hide. They fly around at night and they like to hide on tree trunks during the day, and they're camouflaged. So in England, these moths had a population that they were mostly white. So they were mostly white with black spots. So initially, they would hide on a tree trunk, and they had good camouflage. And sometimes in the population, you get a black moth. And you can see that the black moth on the tree trunk would kind of stick out, and so they was more likely to get eaten by birds. So in the beginning of our scenario, the white alleles, the alleles that made white moths, were more frequent, and the alleles that made black moths were less frequent because of natural selection. Well, in England, they were burning a lot of coal for heat and for cooking, and that produced a lot of soot, and the soot would go out in the air and settle on the tree trunks, and so the tree trunks would become black. And so what we saw in the moth population was that directional selection occurred. The moth population gained more black moths and fewer white moths because the black moths were better camouflaged on the soot-covered tree trunks. So directional selection shifted the population of moths from mostly white to mostly black moths, right? So it shifted in a particular direction. And what's interesting here is once people started burning less coal, then the tree trunks reverted back to lighter colors, and the moth population shifted back towards white. So directional selection can move a population in one direction, and then it can do a 180 and move it in the other direction. Here's another example that's pretty similar to the moths. This is with mice. So there's these populations of mice in the American Southwest, and they can be brown or dark colored. And so it turns out if they live on black lava rocks, the brown ones get eaten by hawks. And if they live in places where the rocks are lighter, the brown ones don't get eaten by hawks as often, but black ones do. So what we find is that in places where the rocks are black, we find more black mice. And where in populations where the rocks are brown or lighter color, we found more brown mice. So again, this is directional selection. Depending on the environment, natural selection is shifting the alleles in a population towards brown when they're living on brown rocks, and it's shifting them towards black fur when they're living on black rocks. Disruptive selection is our second example. So here we start with the same butterfly population, but here natural selection is taking out, removing the most common allele. In this case, the blue, dark blue butterflies. So the arrow represents, let's say again, a predator is eating the blue butterflies. So what happens is the blue alleles become less frequent, and that allows the light blue and the white alleles, as well as the purple alleles, to become more frequent. So in time, our population splits in two. Instead of having one population with this allele frequency, we end up with a population that's heavy on white moths or butterflies and heavy on purple butterflies. A real life example is with the finches in the Galapagos Islands. So initially, medium shaped bills were most frequent, and then because of the seeds that are available on various islands, some of the birds were able to get resources by eating small seeds, and so having a smaller beak while you're eating small seeds is better, and so the small-billed birds became more frequent. And on some islands, having a large bill and eating large seeds was better. So on some islands, having the bird population shifted so that they had larger bills. So in disruptive selection, our bell-shaped curve kind of gets split into two. And you can see how over time, these guys and these guys might become separate species, or the small-billed birds and the large-billed birds might become separate species. Stabilizing selection is our third type of natural selection, our third example. And here, this is the opposite of disruptive selection. Here, the rarer frequency alleles are getting selected against. So the arrows are taking out the light blue and the white, as well as the purple. So what's going to happen is, over time, our bell-shaped curve is going to get tall and skinny. And natural selection is selecting for individuals in a population that have the most frequent allele, in this case, blue butterflies. And the rare alleles get removed. So here we have no white butterflies and no dark purple butterflies. So natural selection is shaping this population and changing the allele frequency by taking out the rarer forms. Birds are a real-life example of this. So let's say we've got a population of birds where we've got skinny birds, medium birds, and fat birds. Well, it turns out that being a skinny bird isn't good, because being skinny means you don't have good fat reserves, and so you're less likely to be able to migrate or to make it through the winter. Also, being a fat bird is bad, because if you're fat, you don't fly very well and you're slow to take off from the ground, so you're more likely to get eaten by a cat. So natural selection simply selects against skinny birds and fat birds and selects for medium birds, because medium-sized birds have a good combo. They're light enough to fly, but they have enough fat reserves that they can migrate or survive the winter. We see stabilizing selection in humans as well. This is a little bit confusing, but bear with me. So what we have going on here is the x-axis is birth weight, all right, in humans. And so very few babies are born at 6 pounds or less. And similarly, very few babies are born at 9 pounds or greater. Most human babies are born around 7 to 9 pounds-ish. Right? And so the yellow line represents the percent of the population of humans that are born at this particular weight. So you can see most humans are born at about 7.5 pounds. Right? The white line is tied to this axis, and it's showing mortality. So you can see that small babies that are born at a low birth rate, have a higher mortality because they're not big enough to survive out of the womb very easily. And that babies that are greater than about 9.5 pounds have increased mortality. And that's because it's hard for mom to birth a 10-pound baby. So we find that human birth weight is an example of stabilizing selection. Over time, through human history, natural selection has selected for human babies to be born in the 7, 8-ish pound range, and against them being born any smaller or any larger than that. And normally I would have you raise your hands and show, how many of you were born at 5 pounds, and my guess is not many of you. How many of you were born at 6 pounds ish, and more people raise your hands. And if I said how many of you were born at 7 or 8 pounds or even 9 pounds, a lot of hands would go up, and the number of you that were born at 9.5 pounds or greater would be pretty small, right? And now we have medicine and surgeries that can help smaller or larger babies survive. But again, for most of human history, we didn't have the ability to do C-sections or to put a baby in a NICU. Sexual selection is another example of natural selection. Sexual selection is when certain traits are selected for because they help individuals in a population attract mates and therefore have more babies. All right, so we could talk about seals. So seals display sexual selection. So females are more likely to mate with males that are larger. And the reason for that is larger males can fight off other males so that they have access to mating with more females. So sexual selection in seals has created males to get larger, and so larger males get rewarded by having more mating opportunities and having more offspring, whereas smaller males don't fight as well, so they don't have as many mating opportunities and therefore fewer offspring, and so the alleles that code for being a smaller male are removed from a population. Sometimes sexual selection leads to sexual dimorphism. Sexual dimorphism just means that males and females look different. They have different phenotypes. And the best example of this is peacocks. So this is a female peacock down here, so you can see that she's got gray feathers. And this is a male peacock. You can see he has these huge tail feathers, or this huge train with brightly colored feathers, and he's got bright blue feathers on his neck and breast. And so why do males and females look different? Well, the reason is females are choosy. So females, they want to mate with the best possible male, but how do they know which male has the best genes, right? And how do males just, how are they going to prove to a female that they've got the best genes? And the answer is that a male peacock that can get resources to have bright feathers and get enough resources to grow this ridiculous train, these huge tail feathers, and can avoid getting stuck in a bush or stuck in a tree or eaten by a fox, those males are good at getting resources and good at surviving. So these bright colors and this big, beautiful train signal to the female that this male is high quality. Why doesn't the female need to have bright colors? How come she doesn't need to signal that she's high quality? And the answer is because males will mate with whatever female comes along, right? Because the male doesn't really invest in reproduction. He provides some sperm, creates an offspring, but his job is done. The female is the one that has to grow this expensive egg and has to maybe sit on a nest where she's at risk of getting eaten by a predator. And so females, because they're investing more in the reproductive process, they're the ones that are choosy. Males, because they're investing less in the reproductive process, they're not as choosy. So we see a difference in males and females because they have different investments in reproduction. What's really interesting here is if you reverse the roles, like in seahorses, maybe you've heard that male seahorses can get pregnant. Well, they don't really get pregnant. The female, after mating, the female seahorse will deposit the fertilized eggs in a little pouch on the male seahorse. So the male seahorse contributes more to the reproductive process. So in seahorses, guess who's picky about how many mates they have and who they mate with? The answer is the male seahorses. They're picky, and the females have to prove that they're worth mating with, because again, the males have to do the heavy lifting. This is also why sexual dimorphism is also why deer, like white-tailed deer, the males have antlers and the females don't. It's because the males have to fight other males with those antlers, and the ones that fight better and have bigger antlers, then they have access to more females. The females don't have to fight. They can mate with the best male that comes along, And so the females don't grow antlers because they don't need them. Here's an example from the insect world. These are stalk-eyed flies, and they and what's happened here is in sexual selection, for whatever reason, I'm not exactly sure why, but the females are attracted to males that have their eyes on these long stalks. So this is the head of the fly right here, and here's his right eye, and here's his left eye. So the wider apart the eyes are, the more the females like them. And so over time, sexual selection has led to sexual dimorphism. Females mate with males that have wider and wider eyes. And so over time, this trait has grown more and more pronounced. Okay, also important is isolation. So for speciation to occur, in other words, for a new species to arise, just like we saw with the bluebirds and the redbirds at the end of my example, a population needs to be isolated. It needs to be separated from other populations. This is called reproductive isolation. It just means that reproduction is happening in a population and reproduction isn't happening with other populations. So again, using the example I used earlier, the population on the left is reproductively isolated from the population on the right that's on the other side of the mountain. So there's 5 different types of reproductive isolation. There's geographic, behavioral, mechanical, temporal, and ecological. And hopefully this is straightforward. It'll make sense as we go along. The first one is geographic isolation. So in geographic isolation, populations are physically isolated from other populations. So again, this will be the example of the mountain between our birds. All right, and what happens is when the populations are separated by a geographical barrier, they just don't cross that geographical barrier. And so the two populations mate, and when mutations pop up in a population, then those mutations, if they're beneficial, they're selected for. But because the two populations are separated, if one mutation pops up in one population, then those alleles are less likely to get transported to the other population. As an example, we can talk about crayfish. So this is a marine crayfish that lives in the Pacific Ocean and Atlantic Ocean. And there's a population over here, and there's a population over here. And sea levels are low now, and so they're separated by some dry land that connects Central America to South America. So the crayfish in this population can't mate with the crayfish in this population. And so over time, they've got different selection pressures and different mutations. And over time, what was once one continuous species has now become 2. This population of crayfish, they've got a big claw on their right arm, and this population of crayfish has a big claw on their left arm. So the reason for this is they were geographically isolated from each other. 2 more examples of geographic isolation. One is with rabbits. So Europeans traveled to the Canary Islands, which is off the coast of Spain, and they took rabbits from the mainland with them, and they released them on the island on purpose so they could come back and hunt them. And so when they stopped there to get supplies, they could hunt some rabbits and get some rabbit stew. And what happened is, over time, these rabbits on the Canary Islands, since they were geographically isolated from the rabbits on the mainland, the rabbits on the island adopted different phenotypes and different behaviors than the rabbits on the mainland. The ones on the island became smaller, and they became nocturnal, meaning they came out at night. And because they were coming out at night, they had smaller eyes. And the ones on the mainland came out during the day and were bigger and had larger eyes. And then if you were to introduce one of these Canary Island rabbits to the rabbits on the European mainland, then they wouldn't breed. So we could say that they became 2 species of rabbits. All right, and then redbud trees are another example. This is an example of an eastern redbud, a tree that we can find here in East Tennessee. And this is a western redbud. So this is a tree that's on the west coast of the USA. And so they're separated by the entire North American continent. So they're geographically isolated, not by a mountain or an island or a dry land separating 2 oceans. They're just separated by distance. And so over time, the redbuds on the East Coast have become a distinct species from the redbuds on the West Coast. And if you bring them together, they can't breed, their pollen is incompatible, and they don't produce viable offspring. Let's just skip that. Behavioral isolation is when populations might not be separated. They might occupy the same place, but they stop mating with each other because their behaviors are different. And so an example of this is in the birds of paradise. And you can see some examples of it in the pictures on the right. And the birds of paradise have these really crazy mating dances. And so the females will watch the males as they dance. The males are dancing to prove their worthiness, to prove that they have good genes. And if the male does the dance right, then the females will mate with them. So as these birds have done different dances and as they have different feather colors, then the females have, some of them like a particular combo of dance and feather colors, whereas other females like a different dance and different feather colors. And so these populations separated over time. So again, they might be in the same area. They're not geographically isolated, but their differences in behavior will show difference. We'll split the population up. So let's see if this link will work.
There are 42 different species of birds of paradise, each more bizarre than the last. This forest is so rich that nourishing food can be gathered very quickly. That leaves the male six-plumed bird of paradise with time to concentrate on other matters, like tidying up his display area. Everything must be spick and span. All is ready. Very impressive, but no one is watching. The superb bird of paradise calls to attract the female. And he has more luck. But what does he have to do to really impress her? She retires to consider her verdict. It's hard not to feel deflated when even your best isn't good enough.
Okay, I hope that worked. Sheesh. All right, so there you could see an example of this in action. Very exciting. Okay, next is mechanical isolation. So this is just when different parts of a population are unable to, or different species in a different individuals in a population are unable to mate with other members of a population because they're incompatible physically. So an example of this would be if this Great Dane and this Chihuahua tried to mate, it would be hard because of the difference in size, right? And so mechanical isolation, you just get differences in anatomy or differences in size that keep them separated. So again, here, they're not separated by geography, they're not separated by behavior, they're separated by differences in size. And we see this in these dogs, we would see it in different, there's some flowers that the parts of the flower are incompatible with other members of the species, and so it generates new species. And then temporal isolation means that individuals are separated by time. So because they're coming out at different times of the year or times of the day, they don't mate with each other. So the periodical cicada in the top picture, these things live underground for 13 to 17 years, and then they come out as adults, and then they all mate with each other. And so if you have a population that's on the 13-year cycle and a population that's on the 17-year cycle, then they're not going to interact with each other. And so the ones that come out after 13 years, they're all going to mate with each other, and then 4 years later, these ones are going to come out and they're going to mate with each other. And so they're off sequence, and so they over time have the potential to become not just two populations, but two different species. Crickets are an example of this. So this is a spring field cricket and this is a fall field cricket. These things overwinter and emerge as adults in the spring and mate with each other, and these overwinter as eggs, I believe, and then they develop in the spring and summer and become adults in the fall, and so they mate in the fall. So the ones that are mating in the fall don't interact with the ones that are mating in the spring, and so you don't have them, these two populations mating, and over time they've turned into two separate species. And then finally, ecological isolation. So in ecological isolation, populations are isolated because they're interacting with the environment in a different way. And so an example from this is chipmunks. Let me go to the slide. So here's a mountain, and this is in the Sierra Nevada mountains in California. And so you can see on the mountain, because of the elevation change, you get different types of trees. At the bottom, you get sagebrush and desert. In the middle, you get pinyon pine. Up here, you get lodgepole pine, and up here you get alpine plants. And imagine if one species of chipmunk moved into this area, it would have lived at all these different elevations, eating seeds. And the ones at the top, over time, they're going to become accustomed to eating the seeds they find in the alpine zone, and these are going to become accustomed to eating lodgepole pine seeds, and so on. And so over time, that one species of chipmunk has become 4 species of chipmunk. And so these guys live down here and eat these seeds, these live here and eat these seeds, these live here and eat these seeds, and so on. And so the ecological isolation has caused one species of chipmunk to become 4. So hopefully this part A helps you understand how the mechanisms of evolution work. Again, it's mutation leading to new alleles and variations in a population, and then natural selection is acting on those mutations to promote good ones and remove bad ones. And then there's some form of isolation that keeps populations separated so that over time they become more different from each other, leading to new species. All right, so in the next slide or the next video, we'll cover part 2, and we'll look at some of the evidences of evolution.